But that's actually untrue. The language has changed very, very little in 400 years. Our relationship to language has changed.
So, Rob, you at the Queensland Shakespeare Ensemble do a lot of Shakespeare. What are the challenges?
Not only, but a lot.
Yeah, well, predominantly Shakespeare. But so, what are the big challenges to producing Shakespeare in a modern world?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the challenges aren't exactly what one might think they would be, or at least not what I thought they'd be when I sort of started out. I think that one of the biggest challenges to Shakespeare, and it sounds a bit backwards, but is actually Shakespeare's prestige, and I would say prestige and notoriety. So somewhere along the line, and I mean, if we want to get into the history of it, it was probably sort of around the late 19th century that it started, and into and through the 20th century, Shakespeare became sort of revered as high art, as literature. And we know that this wasn't the case in Shakespeare's time, that Shakespeare was very popular among all classes. So he was neither highbrow nor lowbrow, he was brow, if that makes sense. he was just a very, very popular dramatist and a playwright, and not a literary figure at all. I mean, there's no evidence that Shakespeare sought to have any of his plays published during his lifetime. Some were published during his lifetime, but not by him, usually by scribes, people sitting before copyright, sitting in the theatre, madly trying to write down every word, or maybe some unscrupulous company members who'd get a hold of the script and run off to the printers. And like I said, there was no intellectual property law, copyright law. Most of his plays that we have were published 8 years after his death, because two of the surviving actors of his company said, hey, these are really good. Other playwrights are publishing their plays. We should publish Bill's plays. I don't know if they called him Bill. Let's pretend they did. So he didn't see his plays as literature, that is something you read out of a book, but rather something to be performed and enjoyed on stage. And actually, that's one of the first challenges, is that for us, when we see words that are written down, as play scripts are, we often think of them as things that are supposed to be read out of a book, off the page, silently or whatever. That's John, the other bald man in the house. He's also an actor in our company. Yes.
Hello,
we
John.
all live together in the same house. No, we don't. It's not the 1970s. Back to the 1570s. So when we experience words that are written down, it becomes this visual thing. And so, I mean, I still struggle if I sit down and open a Shakespeare script and try to read it. I'm a bit ADD, which you can probably already tell. I can't stick to one topic for very long. But it's not just that, it's that the words need to be read out loud. And so many people encounter Shakespeare as stuff you read and study. And I think and hope that it's changing, but certainly when I went to school in the 1570s, no, it wasn't, not last
Maybe
century.
The 1590s.
Yeah. Hey, it was the 19 something. But something. Shakespeare was very definitely presented as literature, as important literature. So that's part of the prestige / notoriety. And we were taught to sit down, and if not silently, at least still, and read it off the page. And that's just not what it was written for. Yeah. It was never intended that way. And so it gets this notoriety as being hard to understand. And people think that's because the language is old. And I know we're going to talk about this later, so I won't get too into it now. But that's actually untrue. The language has changed very, very little in 400 years. Our relationship to language has changed. And that's largely that we're used to receiving big ideas and experiences through the visual, through reading. And also, another one of the challenges is that Shakespeare's language is very dense in imagery, or can be. The poetic part is very dense in imagery, and speaks experiences quite directly, which we'll talk about later, and again is not necessarily some of what we're used to in language. So part of it is that kind of notoriety. So people already approach Shakespeare thinking, I'm not going to understand it. And actually, some of the work we do works with people who don't have that experience of Shakespeare because they don't even know who Shakespeare is. So they're at an advantage because they don't approach it going, this is going to be hard. Sure, at first they're like, thee, thou, what the hell? But within minutes, usually, they're just like going, this is amazing language. This is speaking experiences I've had. So part of it is this notoriety, this idea that Shakespeare is only for the very educated, or as I thought right through to my late 20s, bless my former me soul, that Shakespeare was for wealthy upper class English people. And of course, Shakespeare himself was not, well, he wasn't not wealthy. Certainly by the time he retired as a playwright, he was pretty wealthy, but he was not upper class. He was middle class, arguably upper middle class. But this whole idea that's come around, and one of the struggles we have as a Shakespeare company in particular, and this is our own fault, is that I sometimes tongue-in-cheek, we've said, oh, we're the Shakespeare company for people who don't like Shakespeare, because our approach to Shakespeare is not highfalutin, upper class, oh, look at me, I'm speaking Shakespeare, in fact, to that. But the problem with that is people who think they like Shakespeare probably won't like what we do. And people who would like what we do think they don't like Shakespeare, so they're not going to come and see it. Real problem there. Bad business decision. But regardless, so that's one of the big challenges. And one of the big challenges in Australia comes from that idea that Shakespeare belongs to upper class Britain of the past. Right. And the upper class Britain of the past that people are thinking of is not actually from Shakespeare's time. They're probably thinking of that Victorian and Regency and 20th century as, oh, Shakespeare belongs to those people, which is funny because Shakespeare had been dead several hundred years by the time that particular culture came along. British culture in Shakespeare, or English culture in Shakespeare's time, was very different to what we think of as English, now, which is also a stereotype and not at all, accurate. But at any rate, and in Australia, we have, understandably, because of our history, colonization, we often have a bit of a reaction against that. So, for example, it's often difficult to get people from non-English speaking backgrounds or from Indigenous backgrounds to engage with Shakespeare because they think, no, that belongs to that culture and I'm not down with that culture, which again, as I said, is not the culture of Shakespeare's time at all. And that was me. That was absolutely me. I grew up a little wog sandgroper over in Western Australia, and I thought, I don't want this. This is, British imperialist culture, blah, blah, blah. And I resisted it for the longest time. And the funny thing was that changed when I went to the United States. I lived in the United States because the United States does not have that relationship to Shakespeare. And I think maybe it's because they had a Revolutionary War. They had a war where they chucked the British imperialists out. And after that, they were free to own the English language, English literature from before that time in a way that they could. And the Americans really do own, and I don't mean they solely own Shakespeare, but when they approach Shakespeare, it is in their way. And there's probably more Shakespeare done per capita in the United States than anywhere else in the world. Every state of the 50 states has at least one Shakespeare festival. Most states have a Shakespeare in Prisons program. Many, many more than in the UK. So I think that the biggest challenge is the notoriety that Shakespeare is hard and for these people, and also the prestige in a sense, because people think, again, it's for a particular class, it's for people of a certain educational level. And we have to remember that it is highly likely that a lot of the actors in Shakespeare's own company could not read or write. beyond kind of writing their names. The literacy rates in London were about 50%, and that definitely skewed towards the upper classes. And actors, by and large, were not from the upper classes, had very little formal education. The playwrights would have had some, obviously they needed to write. But this idea that in order to appreciate Shakespeare, even to understand it in your ear, that you somehow have to have attained a certain educational level, which simply isn't true.
Big thanks to Rob Pensalfini, Artistic Director of the Queensland Shakespeare Ensemble. Now, QSE do amazing work with Shakespeare, and you can learn a little bit more about that through the links in the description below. And down there will also be a link to the mini playlist of all the videos that I shot with Rob around aspects of Shakespeare. He is a wealth of knowledge, so definitely check that out. It would be great if you give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and if you haven't already, share it with someone who you think might need it. Thanks very much. Have a look at some of these other Shakespeare videos, and I will see you there.